hadn't planned on driving past my ex-husband's old cabin that night. It was late October of 2012, the kind of season when the air feels colder than it should, and everything smells like wet leaves and damp earth. I was 37 back then, and I had been divorced from Daniel for almost 5 years. We hadn't spoken in a long time, and I didn't keep track of where he lived or what he was doing. But that cabin had belonged to his family for decades, tucked away on a stretch of dirt road outside of Ashford, Maine. I had stayed there with him many times when we were still together. I knew the way without even thinking about it. That evening, I was driving back from visiting a friend in a nearby town. A storm had rolled in faster than I expected, and the rain was coming down in thick sheets. My headlights barely cut through it, and the wipers slapped across the windshield in a steady, useless rhythm. The highway had been empty for miles, and when I finally turned off onto the smaller road, I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, the dark pressed in even heavier, the trees crowding on either side, branches bending low like they wanted to scrape against the car. I wasn't planning to stop anywhere, but the rain grew worse, and the tires kept slipping in the mud. That was when I realized I was close to the old cabin. I remembered the turn before I even saw it. My stomach knotted up when I thought about it, but I kept going. The road curved, and then I saw it through the rain. A faint outline between the trees, the roofline barely visible against the night sky. The place looked smaller than I remembered, slouched into the ground like it was giving up. The wooden siding was black with rot, and parts of the roof sagged. The porch, where Daniel and I once sat with beers in the summer, now looked warped and broken. My first thought was that no one could possibly still use it. My second thought was that I needed to keep driving. But then the car sputtered. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died right there in front of the cabin. I twisted the key over and over, but it only clicked and wheezed. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal in that stretch of woods. The rain hammered harder, and the windows began fogging up. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal, knowing what my only choice was. I grabbed my jacket from the back seat, pulled the hood tight, and ran through the mud up toward the porch. The boards flexed and groaned under my weight. For a second, I thought the whole thing might collapse. I pressed my hand against the door, and it moved easily, swinging inward with a long creak. Inside, it smelled of mildew, old wood, and something sour I couldn't place. The floor was coated with dust, but there were tracks, scuffed marks where boots had walked recently. My chest tightened when I saw that. I had been certain the place was abandoned. The main room was just how I remembered it, only worse. The old stone fireplace sat blackened, a pile of ashes still inside. The couch we once used was torn open, stuffing spilling onto the floor. The small table was covered with cans, some empty, some crushed. A single lantern sat on the counter near the sink, and beside it was a coffee mug with something dried in the bottom. My skin prickled. I kept telling myself maybe Daniel still came out here from time to time. Maybe he hadn't let go of the cabin even though everything else had changed. But another thought crept in. What if it wasn't him? What if someone else had been living here using this place to stay hidden? I tried not to dwell on it. I pulled my jacket tighter and sat on the edge of the couch, just to get my bearings. My shoes were soaked, and the bottoms of my jeans were caked in mud. The storm rattled the windows, and the roof groaned under the weight of the rain. As I sat there, I noticed something on the far wall. A section of the wood paneling had been pushed aside, and behind it, a crawl space yawned open. I remembered that spot. It used to just be storage, a place for tools and junk. But now there was a thin mattress on the floor inside, a pile of blankets, and a plastic jug of water. Next to it sat a backpack zipped up tight. My mouth went dry. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They were living here. I stood slowly, not wanting the floor to creak, and backed away. I kept thinking about my dead car sitting out there, about the fact that I had no way to call for help. If whoever was staying here came back, I'd have nowhere to go. The sound of the storm filled the cabin, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else. The crunch of gravel, faint but steady, coming from outside. My heart slammed. I moved to the window and pushed the curtain just enough to peek through. There was a flashlight beam cutting through the rain, swaying with each step. Someone was coming up the road. I dropped the curtain and stepped back, scanning the room for somewhere to hide. The crawl space wasn't an option. I couldn't force myself into that corner. Instead, I slipped down the short hall toward the back room. It used to be a bedroom, though now the mattress was nothing but springs, the dresser drawers half open. I pressed myself into the corner, holding my breath. The front door opened with a slow groan, and heavy boots thudded across the floor. The beam of the flashlight cut across the walls. I couldn't see the person, but I could hear the way they moved, steady and unhurried, like they had done this many times before. I waited, my body trembling so hard I thought the sound would give me away. The boots moved toward the crawl space, and I heard the zipper of the backpack. A few moments of silence passed, then the sound of water sloshing. He or whoever it was drinking. I risked leaning just enough to see through the cracked doorframe. The figure was tall, wearing a heavy jacket and a cap pulled low. I couldn't make out his face, but something about the shape of him, the way he moved, made my stomach lurch with recognition. I hadn't seen Daniel in years, but I knew it was him. He looked thinner, older, but it was him. And he wasn't living a normal life anymore. He was squatting here, hiding out, maybe running from something. The realization hit me hard. If he saw me here, he wouldn't react well. Not after everything that happened between us. Not after the divorce, the fights, the way things ended. I stayed frozen until he finally sat down on the edge of the couch, rubbing his face with both hands. His shoulders sagged like the weight of the world was crushing him. I thought about slipping out the back door, but I knew the hinges screamed too loud. I waited until his flashlight dimmed, and he stretched out across the couch, pulling a blanket over himself. The storm outside covered every noise I made as I crept back toward the hall. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might wake him, but he didn't move. When I reached the door, I held my breath and stepped out onto the porch. The rain had slowed, only a drizzle now. I ran through the mud, straight to my car, not caring how much noise I made. I pulled at the handle, climbed inside, and turned the key. The engine roared back to life like nothing had ever been wrong with it. Relief washed over me so hard I almost cried. I slammed the car into drive and tore down the road, mud spraying behind me. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, the cabin miles behind me. My hands shook on the wheel, and my chest felt tight. I knew what I had seen. Daniel wasn't gone, wasn't living some new life somewhere far away. He was still there, hiding in that cabin, living like a shadow of the man I once knew. I never told anyone. I never went back. But even now, years later, I think about that night whenever I hear the sound of heavy rain on the roof. I think about how close I came to him seeing me, and I wonder what would have happened if he had. It was the summer of 1998 when I signed up for a seasonal job as a park ranger in northern Montana. I was 28 at the time, old enough to want steady pay, but still restless enough to take jobs that put me far away from towns and cities. They placed me at a small ranger station on the edge of a dense forest that stretched for miles. The cabin was old, built sometime in the late 60s, and it sat back from the main road by about 2 miles of dirt track. The nearest ranger outpost was 12 miles away. I knew I'd be mostly alone, with only the occasional check-in by radio and the long drives down gravel roads when it was time to make rounds. That kind of solitude had always seemed appealing in theory. The cabin itself was simple. One main room with a desk, a narrow bed against the far wall, a wood stove, and shelves lined with maps, logbooks, and supplies. In back, there was a small bathroom and a storage closet. The place smelled of dust and old wood, and when the wind pushed through the cracks in the siding, it carried pine needles and the faint metallic tang of the forest. I settled in quickly, telling myself that a few months up there would be a kind of reset. The days were quiet and repetitive. I'd wake early, check the weather, log any sightings of wildlife, and sometimes patrol the trails to make sure hikers hadn't gotten themselves into trouble. Most of the time, there was nobody out there. The forest was thick, with endless ridges and valleys, and even in summer it carried a kind of weight to it, like it pressed against you if you stood still for too long. At night, the silence wasn't empty. It was alive with crickets, owls, and the occasional snap of branches under something heavy moving where I couldn't see. It wasn't until late July that things started to feel off. That week had been hot and unusually dry. Fires were always a risk, so I was especially alert. One afternoon, while making my way back to the cabin after a long sweep of the southern ridge, I noticed something strange near the edge of the trail. A cigarette, but still fresh, crushed into the dirt. There hadn't been any hikers registered in the area for 3 days, and the rules were clear. No smoking in the forest. Put me on edge. I bagged the butt, wrote it in my log, and reminded myself that maybe someone had come through without signing in. Still, it nagged at me. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the usual shuffle of deer or the eerie bark of a fox. This was heavier, deliberate, like footsteps on gravel. I stayed in bed, my chest tight, until the sound faded back into the trees. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt by the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. The tread was different, narrower, like a work boot. Whoever it was had stood near the window for a while before turning back into the forest. I wrote it down, filed it, and told myself maybe it was another ranger making rounds, though that didn't sit right. I hadn't heard a truck or a radio call. The following week, the unease grew worse. I started finding little things moved inside the cabin. My map had been shifted on the desk. The logbook was left open to the wrong page. My spare flashlight wasn't where I'd left it. I kept telling myself I was tired, maybe careless, but deep down I knew someone had been inside while I was gone. One morning I woke to the door slightly ajar. I never left it open. The padlock hung useless on the latch, not broken but unhooked, as if someone had slipped it free with practiced ease. My stomach turned cold. I checked the cabin carefully, every corner, every shadow. Nothing was missing, at least nothing obvious. But the knowledge that someone had been standing in the same room where I slept made the air feel wrong, heavy with a kind of invisible pressure. I started double-checking every lock, wedging a chair under the doorknob at night, keeping my radio closer. The problem was I didn't know when they came or why. On August 12th, I found something that made it all worse. I had gone out on a short patrol before sunrise, the forest still damp with dew, my boots brushing against wet ferns. When I got back, less than 2 hours later, there was a folded piece of paper on my desk. No envelope, just a torn page from one of the spare notepads. 3 words were scrawled in rough handwriting. "You are watched." The words punched the air out of me. I stood there, staring at the paper until my hands started shaking. Whoever it was hadn't just been inside, they wanted me to know it. They'd come while I was gone, not long gone, and left a message right where I couldn't miss it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the desk with my flashlight in one hand and the radio in the other, straining to hear over the buzzing insects and the groan of the forest. Every crunch of leaves outside sounded deliberate. Every creak in the cabin walls made my throat tighten. The following days blurred together. I filed reports, though I doubted they'd be read anytime soon. I considered driving down to the main outpost, but it meant leaving the cabin empty, and the thought of returning to find more signs of intrusion made me hesitate. Instead, I stayed, alert and exhausted, waiting for something else to happen. It did. On the night of August 17th, just past midnight, I heard the door handle rattle. Not once, but several times, as if someone was testing it. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't move. The chair wedged beneath the knob held. But then came a long silence, followed by slow steps circling the cabin. Gravel crunched, twigs snapped, and once, the faint drag of fingers along the siding. I sat frozen, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps faded into the forest, swallowed by the dark. At dawn, I went outside. Fresh prints circled the cabin, same tread as before. Whoever it was had walked around it twice before disappearing into the trees. I followed the tracks for about 30 yards until they vanished into the undergrowth. Whoever they were, they knew how to cover their trail. By then, I had made up my mind. I packed my bag, loaded the truck, and wrote one final note in the log. Asterisk possible stalker in area, evidence of repeated trespassing. Leaving cabin, request follow-up investigation. Asterisk driving away, every bump of the dirt road felt like it carried me farther from something I had narrowly escaped. The forest, once a quiet and steady place, now felt like it had been holding something dangerous all along, something human. I never found out who had been watching me or why. The Park Service said they'd investigate, but I never heard a conclusion. For years after, though, I'd wake in the night to the memory of those footsteps circling the cabin and the words on that torn piece of paper. The lesson stayed with me clear as day. In the wilderness, you worry about animals, storms, and accidents, but the most unsettling danger is when another person decides to step quietly into your life, unnoticed, and remind you that solitude isn't always yours. The dirt road twisted and dipped through the woods, the headlights catching wet leaves and the occasional crooked fence post. I was 29 years old, and it was late autumn of 1994 in rural Pennsylvania. The air had that sharp bite that told me winter wasn't far off. My truck rattled along the uneven track, suspension groaning, as if it didn't want to go any farther. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere back near town, and by the time I realized it, I figured it was better just to keep moving forward until I found another road. The trees thinned out and suddenly a clearing opened in front of me. At first, I thought it was just an overgrown field, but then I saw the outline of crooked stone markers poking out from the grass. A graveyard, not the neat kind you see beside churches, but an old, forgotten one. The stones were chipped, tilted, some broken in half. It looked like nobody had been buried there in decades. At the far end of the clearing, tucked into the tree line, was a structure. My lights caught the gray outline of a cabin. It looked weathered, leaning a little, the roof sagging. I didn't want to stop. Everything about the place felt wrong, but the gas gauge was low, the needle close to empty. I needed to rest, maybe get my bearings. The cabin seemed better than sleeping in the truck with the cold creeping in. I parked just off the dirt path, grabbed my bag, and walked up through the knee-high grass. The sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves seemed too loud. Every stone marker I passed looked like it was watching me, even though I knew that was just the way they leaned in the dark. The cabin door was warped, but it opened with a heavy shove. Inside smelled of mold and old wood. My flashlight beam cut through the dust and cobwebs. The single room had a stone fireplace against one wall, a table with one leg cracked, and a few wooden chairs scattered around. The floor creaked under my steps, and I could hear my skittering inside the walls. I dropped my bag near the fireplace and set about clearing some space. I had a small camping stove and a blanket rolled up. When I lit the stove, the tiny hiss of gas felt comforting, the small blue flame steady in the stale air. I made coffee, just enough to warm myself. For a while, it almost felt manageable. The cabin was cold, but it gave me a roof. The graveyard outside was just land with old stones, nothing more. I tried to convince myself of that, but the longer I sat there, the more the silence pressed in. It wasn't like the quiet of the woods I was used to when camping. This was different, heavy, almost like the place was swallowing sound. I went to check the windows. 2 of them faced the graveyard. The glass was dusty and streaked, but I could see the outlines of stones leaning against the moonlight. The grass swayed slightly in the breeze, but I didn't see any movement beyond that. Still, something in me tightened. It was the kind of feeling you get when you sense someone's eyes on you, even when no one is there. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the tension. My flashlight beam kept sliding back to those windows, and every time I checked, I expected to see something. Maybe a person standing there, maybe nothing. Around midnight, I finally stretched out on the floor with my blanket pulled around me. I kept the flashlight near my hand. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay there listening. The cabin settled every now and then, wood popping in the cold. The wind outside pushed against the walls. Then, at some point, I heard something else. It was faint, a scraping sound, like stone against stone. My eyes opened wide in the dark. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. First, nothing. Then, yes, another scrape, slow, deliberate, came from outside, somewhere near the graveyard. I sat up and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut across the room, but the sound stopped. My heart was thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it was probably an animal. Raccoons, maybe, but I couldn't bring myself to lie back down. After several minutes of silence, I forced myself to check outside. I opened the cabin door, the hinges groaning loud enough to make me wince. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of damp earth and leaves. I shone the light out across the clearing. The grass rippled in the wind, gravestones leaning at odd angles. Nothing moved, but when I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the gravestones, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, looked freshly disturbed. The dirt around it seemed darker, looser, like it had been dug up recently. My chest tightened. I knew I hadn't noticed that when I walked past earlier. I backed inside quickly and bolted the door with a piece of wood I found leaning against the wall. I told myself I would wait it out until morning. No reason to panic. Morning would bring light, and then I'd leave. But the noises started again, softer this time. A dragging, like something heavy being pulled through grass. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. The sound would come for a few seconds, then stop. The silence in between was worse than the sound itself. My mind kept painting pictures. Someone moving between the stones, slowly circling closer. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me into a half-sleep, because the next thing I knew, the first gray light of dawn was pushing through the windows. My body felt stiff and sore from the cold floor. I grabbed my things fast, ready to get out of there. When I opened the door, the air was icy and still. The graveyard stretched quiet in front of me. I walked quickly across the clearing, eyes darting from stone to stone. I didn't want to look too closely, but something caught my attention. The disturbed grave I had noticed the night before was worse. The dirt was piled higher, messier, as if more had been dug out. And on the cabin's porch, near where I had been standing, I saw something that froze me in place. It was a streak of dark earth, smeared across the wood, like something had been dragged up to the door and then pulled away again. That was enough. I sprinted to my truck, tossed my bag inside, and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then roared to life. I didn't look back at the cabin as I pulled away, tires spinning in the wet dirt. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. When I finally made it back to a paved road, I pulled over and sat for a long time, trying to calm down. I told myself again and again that it was just animals, or maybe kids messing around. But deep down, I knew what I had seen wasn't the work of animals, and no kids would come out that far at night to dig up graves. I never went back down that road, never tried to find the cabin again. Some places you realize don't want visitors. That graveyard cabin was one of them. And even now, years later, I can still hear that slow, dragging sound in the back of my mind whenever the night is too quiet. The countryside has always had a strange pull on me, the kind that settles deep in your chest and makes you feel like you're stepping into another time. In the summer of 1998, I rented a small wooden cabin outside a quiet town in northern Missouri. I was 28 then, restless and worn out from the noise of city living. The cabin was old, sitting on the edge of overgrown fields with a thin dirt road leading to it. A single wire fence ran along the property line, rusted and sagging in some places. The first time I saw it, it looked harmless, even peaceful. The roof sagged a little in the middle. The wood had grayed from years of rain and sun, and weeds grew tall around the porch steps. But the inside was clean enough, 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen, with a stove that rattled when I lit it. The air smelled faintly of damp wood, and the windows had screens with small holes chewed through by bugs. I told myself it was fine, it was cheap, and I wanted quiet. The land around the cabin stretched out wide, no houses in sight. Just endless cornfields, a patch of woods about half a mile away, and silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. At night, it was even worse. The nearest streetlight was miles down the road, so when the sun went down, everything outside my window disappeared into pitch black. The only sound was crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. For the first few nights, I convinced myself it was peaceful. I told myself I'd get used to the quiet. But something about that silence felt wrong. It wasn't calm. It was expectant, like the land itself was holding its breath. I noticed it more when I took my dog out. He was a big shepherd mix named Tanner, usually fearless, the type to bark at strangers without hesitation. But out there in that open land, he changed. Every night when I took him out to the edge of the porch, he would freeze. His ears would point straight up, his eyes locked onto the fields or the tree line in the distance. He wouldn't bark. He wouldn't move. His body stiffened, and a low growl vibrated in his throat. Sometimes, his hair would bristle along his back, and he would slowly back toward the door. The first week, I brushed it off. Maybe coyotes were out there. Maybe he smelled a raccoon. But the more it happened, the more it gnawed at me. It wasn't once in a while. It was every single night, and always toward the same patch of trees far across the field. During the day, I walked the property line. The grass was knee-high in places, thick with ticks and burrs. I found old rusted tools buried in the weeds, empty beer cans that looked decades old, and what I thought might have been the remains of a chicken coop collapsed under vines. The land felt abandoned, left to rot slowly under the sun. When I looked toward the woods Tanner always growled at, I felt something I couldn't name, a weight in my chest like someone standing too close behind me. By the second week, my sleep was broken. I'd lie awake at night, listening to Tanner pace back and forth at the foot of my bed, nails tapping against the wood floor. Sometimes he'd stop and stand by the window, staring out into the black. His low growl would start again, and my stomach would knot up. I'd force myself to look outside, but there was never anything there, just the fields invisible under the night sky. One night, around 2 in the morning, Tanner woke me up with a sudden snarl. His body was pressed against the door, stiff as stone, teeth bared at the darkness outside. I sat up, my heart pounding. I tried to steady my breathing, but then I heard it too. Not coyotes, not crickets, something else. The sound was faint, carried by the wind, but I swear I heard it. The crunch of footsteps in the grass, slow and deliberate, moving along the fence line. I froze, every muscle in my body locked. Tanner's growl deepened, his eyes following the sound as it crept closer, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I sat there in the dark, every nerve on fire, listening. Minutes passed. Tanner eventually lowered his head, but he didn't take his eyes off that direction until dawn. The next morning, I forced myself to walk the fence line where I thought the steps had come from. The grass was pressed down in places, trampled as if something had been moving through it. My throat dried as I crouched down and saw a clear boot print in the dirt. Not old, not faded, fresh. The nearest neighbor was miles away. That day, I kept Tanner close. I didn't go far from the cabin. The air felt heavier, like the silence was watching me. I kept replaying the sound of those steps in my head. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been there. Someone had walked right up to my land in the middle of the night, and I hadn't seen a thing. That night, I locked the door tight, pulled the curtains shut, and kept a flashlight by my bed. Tanner stayed restless, pacing more than usual, his ears constantly twitching. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, not footsteps, but a metallic sound. A faint scrape against the wire fence, like someone dragging something along it. I didn't move. My chest burned from holding my breath. The scrape went on for what felt like forever, slow, steady, deliberate, until it stopped directly across from the cabin. Tanner was trembling, low growls spilling out of his throat, but he didn't lunge at the door. He stayed planted, like he knew whatever was out there was too close, too real. I barely slept that night. By dawn, I was done. The fields, the cabin, the silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what little I had, loaded the truck, and kept Tanner close by my side. Before I left, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The sunlight made it look harmless again, just an old wooden place surrounded by nothing. But when I glanced toward the fence line, I saw it. Another boot print, pressed deep into the dirt, facing the cabin. That was enough for me. I drove down that dirt road and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never went back. The landlord called me weeks later, asking why I left without notice, but I never explained. All I know is that something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. They never tried to come inside, never made a move past the fence. But they wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me to feel it, and I did. Every single night. That cabin is probably still standing, rotting a little more each year. Someone else might rent it. Someone else might sit on that porch at night, staring out across the fields. And maybe they'll hear it too. That slow, steady scrape of metal against rusted wire, and the sound of boots pressing into the dirt. I'll never forget it. I had rented a small cabin in the north of England, not far from the edge of the Peak District. It was early autumn of 2014, and I was 32 years old at the time, working as a freelance writer. I wanted quiet, a place away from the city noise and distractions, so I booked the cabin for 2 weeks. It sat off a narrow country road with one gravel path leading up to it. The cabin wasn't new or polished. It looked as if it had been built decades ago. The wood was weathered, the roof slanted, and there were moss patches climbing up the stone chimney. It sat close to a small wooded area, where the trees were tall and bunched tightly together, cutting off most of the light once the sun started to drop. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen with an old stove, a wood-burning fireplace in the main room, one bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. The air smelled faintly of damp wood, the kind that never really goes away in old buildings. I settled in quickly, setting up my laptop on the wooden table by the window, where I could see the fields stretch out in the distance. The place was quiet, almost too quiet at night, with only the wind rattling through the trees. The first few nights were uneventful. I worked during the day and sat by the fire in the evening. I would sometimes walk the gravel road before dusk, just to stretch my legs. On the fourth night, things began to feel different. I had been sitting at the table, scrolling through old notes on my laptop, when I thought I noticed something through the window. The light outside had faded, the fields now a dull gray, and for a moment I thought I saw movement near the edge of the woods. It was a figure standing still, too far to make out clearly. I blinked, leaned closer, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably a tree or a shadow playing tricks, and I left it at that. The next day, I avoided looking too long out the window. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that figure. In daylight, the woods looked harmless, but when darkness settled in, they seemed heavier, darker than they should be. That night, I made sure to close the curtains before I lit the fire. I remember sitting on the couch with a book, trying to distract myself. Then, just after 10, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, more like the crunch of gravel under slow steps. I froze, my heart hammering, straining to listen. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering close, but it had sounded too steady, too much like footsteps. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to silence, expecting to hear something else. In the morning, I forced myself to walk outside and check. Nothing seemed unusual, though I did notice faint impressions on the gravel, not deep enough to be from a car, but spaced apart like steps. I told myself it must have been the postman or someone passing through, though deep down it didn't feel right. 2 nights later, it happened again. I was in bed when I heard the sound, this time softer, like someone brushing against the side of the cabin. My stomach twisted. I got up, went to the front window, and lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to look out. The yard was dim under the weak glow of the moon. First, I saw nothing. Then my eyes caught it. A woman, standing just beyond the gravel, near the edge of the trees. She wasn't moving, not even shifting her weight. Just standing there, her head slightly tilted toward the cabin. I couldn't make out her face clearly, but I could see she wore a long coat, the kind that hung down past her knees. My throat went dry. I dropped the curtain and backed away, standing in the dark, barely breathing. I didn't hear her move, no footsteps, no sound at all. I stayed up for hours, waiting for something else, but the night passed in silence. When daylight came, I checked again. There was nothing there, no sign she had ever been standing in that spot. That day, I couldn't focus on work. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see her again. My mind played over the details, how still she had been, how close to the trees. I told myself I might have imagined it, stress and lack of sleep twisting my vision. But that night, just after midnight, I woke to a sound that erased any doubt. It was slow, deliberate tapping on the glass window in the living room. 3 taps, evenly spaced. I froze in bed, my skin crawling. After a minute, it came again, the same rhythm. I forced myself to get up, my legs weak as I crept toward the living room. I stayed back from the window, just close enough to peek through the curtain's edge. She was there again. The same woman, closer this time, standing right at the window. Her face was pale, her hair dark, stringy, falling around her shoulders. Her hand rested against the glass, fingers slightly bent as if she had just tapped it. She was staring straight into the cabin. I backed away quickly, my chest pounding so hard I thought I would pass out. I didn't open the door, didn't try to shout. I just went back to the bedroom and locked the door, pressing a chair under the handle even though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. I sat on the bed with my phone, but there was no signal. I couldn't call anyone. I stayed awake until dawn, and when I finally checked the window again, she was gone. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't take another night there. I didn't care if I lost the money I had paid for the place. I just wanted out. As I loaded my bag into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach sink even more. On the dirt just outside the living room window, there were fresh shoe prints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, narrow, clearly from a woman's shoes. I didn't stay to look any closer. I drove out of there fast, barely looking in the rearview mirror. The narrow country road seemed longer than before, the woods pressing in from both sides. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop until I hit the next town. I pulled into a petrol station and sat there for a while, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. Later, I told myself I had done the right thing leaving. Whoever she wasn't lost or looking for help. People don't stand outside cabins in the middle of the night, staring in through windows. They don't leave without a word after tapping on the glass. I still don't know what she wanted, but I know this. If I had stayed another night, if I had opened that door, something bad would have happened. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night. Sure, I'll hear that same slow tapping on my window. And every time, I remember the way she looked. Motionless, silent, her pale face pressed toward the glass. That image never leaves me, follows me everywhere. I was 28 years old when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the forests of northern Minnesota. It was October of 2016, the time of year when the days were short and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. I had been working long hours at my job in the city, and I thought a break away from people, traffic, and noise would do me good. The cabin was simple but solid, built in the 70s. Sitting at the edge of a long dirt road that wound through thick pine woods. The nearest small town was almost an hour away by truck. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no neighbors within sight, and no cell service once I left the paved road behind. That was part of the appeal. I brought enough food and supplies for weeks, a couple of books, and a small generator I used only when I needed to charge a light or run the coffee maker. Most nights, I relied on a kerosene lamp and the fireplace. The first few days passed quietly. I hiked during the day, cooked simple meals, and wrote in a notebook at night. The silence was heavy but peaceful. Every so often I'd hear the creak of old wood in the cabin or the wind rattling the pine branches, but nothing unusual. It was on the fifth night that I noticed something that unsettled me. I had stepped outside to bring in firewood before the temperature dropped too low. The air was sharp, the kind that made each breath feel like it burned a little. The moon wasn't out, but the sky was clear and the stars lit the clearing around the cabin. As I walked to the small woodpile, I noticed a set of tracks pressed into the dirt that hadn't been there earlier in the day. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. I crouched down and looked at them closely, shining my flashlight. The ground was hard, so the prints weren't deep, but they were clear enough to see. Someone had walked from the direction of the tree line toward the cabin and then turned back the way they came. I hadn't heard a truck or seen any headlights on the dirt road, and I hadn't been outside since mid-afternoon. I tried to tell myself it could have been a hunter passing through, maybe checking his bearings. But the prints came uncomfortably close to the cabin, circling about 20 feet from the front porch before turning back. I brought the firewood in, bolted the door, and sat by the fire longer than usual that night, listening to every noise outside. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the trees where the prints had started. I expected them to fade into the pine needles, but they were still there, continuing into the woods. I followed them for a few minutes before they disappeared into thicker brush. Something about the direction bothered me. It wasn't toward the dirt road. Whoever it was had come from deeper in the woods. The next few days I tried to ignore it. I kept busy, made small repairs around the cabin, and spent longer stretches reading. At night, though, I started hearing things I couldn't explain away so easily. A branch snapping close by, the the sound of something brushing against the outer wall of the cabin. Once I woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. I sat there in bed, not moving, barely breathing, until the noise stopped. When I finally gathered the courage to check, the porch was empty. By the 10th day, I was running on little sleep. My nerves were frayed. I kept the rifle I had brought for hunting loaded and leaning by the door. During the day, I would find little signs that confirmed I wasn't imagining it. A piece of bark stripped from a tree, as if someone had scraped it with a knife. A cigarette but near the back of the cabin, damp from dew. None of these things were mine. One afternoon, I decided to try and settle my mind by chopping wood. The steady rhythm calmed me, and for a while I almost felt normal again. Then, as I brought the axe down, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly and saw someone in the trees. Just for a moment. A man, standing there in dark clothing, watching me. When I blinked, he stepped back into the woods. I dropped the axe and shouted, but there was no response. I ran to the tree line, my heart hammering, but when I got there, the forest was empty. That night was the worst. The wind had died down, and the air was so still I could hear the faint ticking of the cooling metal on the stove. I kept the lamp on later than usual. At around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the dirt outside, slow, heavy, circling the cabin. I gripped the rifle and sat in a chair facing the front door. The footsteps stopped, and for a long stretch there was silence. Then I heard a scrape against the side of the cabin, like someone dragging a piece of metal along the wall. My breathing was loud in my own ears. I thought about yelling, but fear locked my throat. Instead, I waited, sitting perfectly still, watching the shadows from the lamp stretch across the wooden floor. Hours seemed to pass that way. At some point, I must have drifted in and out of a daze because the next thing I knew, light was coming through the window. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. My stomach dropped when I saw what was on the wall. Long, thin scratches in the wood, starting at eye level and running down toward the dirt. I couldn't tell if it had been a knife or something else, but it was deliberate. I also saw fresh boot prints circling the cabin, closer than before. Whoever it was had been only feet from where I sat holding the rifle. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed what I could into my truck as fast as possible. I didn't even bother to clean up or put things away properly. As I drove down the dirt road, every bump and turn felt like it was slowing me down too much. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees and watch me leave. When I finally reached the small town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, just breathing. The relief of being around other people was overwhelming. I told myself I'd go back to the cabin the next day with a friend to grab the rest of my things, but I never did. I let the owner know I was leaving early and told him I didn't want to explain why. I drove back to the city that same afternoon and tried not to think about it anymore. Even now, years later, I still wonder who was out there in those woods, circling the cabin night after night. I never found out and I never went back. But every time I think about that scrape against the wall in the dead of night, I know I made the right choice leaving when I did. I grew up in southern Iowa, but in 1998, after saving enough money, I bought a small piece of farmland outside a town called Corridon. It was 64 acres, mostly pasture and brush, with an old weather-beaten cabin at the edge of the property. The cabin had been built in the 1940s, patched over the years with cheap boards and tar paper, and whoever owned it before me hadn't cared much about upkeep. The place had no insulation, no running water, and the floor creaked like it had arthritis, but I didn't buy the land for comfort. I wanted a quiet place, away from town, where I could hunt, work with my hands, and have some space to breathe. The farm sat back off a dirt road, a mile from the nearest neighbor. On clear days, you could see the distant silos and hear the faint sound of tractors in the distance. But most nights it was just me, the crickets, and the constant hum of the wind through the trees. The land had once been used for cattle, but now it was mostly overgrown, thick with weeds and cedar. The cabin stood at the edge of a small grove, surrounded by rusting fence lines and old tools half buried in the soil. The first few weeks living there were uneventful. I patched up the roof with tin sheets, replaced a broken window with plywood, and rigged up a little propane stove so I could cook. I didn't have electricity yet, so evenings were spent by lantern light. The days were long but simple, cutting brush, mending fences, and clearing trails through the woods. But I noticed something early on that unsettled me. I'd wake up to find things moved outside. Nothing major at first, just tools shifted from where I'd left them. A spade that had been leaning against the shed would be lying flat on the ground. A coil of wire I'd left by the fence line would be unwound across the grass. I blamed animals at first, raccoons or stray dogs nosing around. But as the weeks passed, the disturbances became harder to explain. One morning, I found the door of my shed wide open, though I knew I had latched it. Another day, a pile of split firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered across the yard. I started locking everything tight, even nailed boards across the shed door, but it kept happening. By late September, the nights grew colder, and I relied more on the wood stove inside the cabin. I had stacked cords of oak against the cabin wall, but sometimes I'd wake up and see the pile thinned out, like someone had taken logs in the night. That made less sense than anything else. No raccoon was hauling off armloads of firewood. One Saturday, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I turned out my lantern and sat in the dark by the window, shotgun across my lap. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Soft crunches in the leaves near the cabin. Not the light scurry of an animal, but the steady tread of boots. My chest tightened, and every nerve in me went sharp. The steps moved around the cabin slowly, then stopped by the woodpile. I could hear the scrape of logs being dragged. I held my breath, waiting for the shape to pass by the window, but nothing came. After a few minutes, the sound faded toward the tree line. At dawn, I stepped outside. Sure enough, the woodpile was missing a few logs, and fresh tracks led across the frost-covered grass. They were footprints, human. From that morning on, the place never felt the same. It wasn't mine anymore, not fully. I was sharing it with someone I couldn't see. I tried brushing it off, convincing myself it was just a drifter, maybe someone camping in the woods and stealing what they needed. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why take firewood when the woods were full of downed limbs? Why open my shed but leave my tools lying in the dirt? It felt like someone was toying with me, testing how far they could go. The days got shorter, and every creak of the cabin made me tense. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and strain my ears for footsteps outside. Some nights there was nothing, but others I was sure I could hear faint movement in the trees, just beyond the reach of the lantern light. In early October, I found something that shook me worse than all the rest. I was clearing brush along the fence line when I came across a pile of bones. Not deer bones. These were small, clean, and stacked carefully, like someone had arranged them. A rabbit skull sat on top. I backed away and left them untouched. I didn't want to know who had done it or why. That evening, I nailed shut the cabin windows from the inside and kept my shotgun close. My stomach was tight the whole night. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever was out there had been watching me, close enough to know my routines, close enough to leave things where I would find them. The breaking point came a week later. I returned from town with supplies, pulling my truck up the rutted path, and saw the cabin door hanging wide open. My gut dropped. I knew I had locked it that morning. I killed the engine and sat there for a long minute, staring. The yard was quiet, No movement, no sound but the wind through the weeds. Finally, I forced myself out and crept toward the cabin, shotgun raised. The door had been forced, wood splintered around the latch. Inside, things were shifted. My lantern lay on the floor, my bedding torn off the cot. On the table, my hunting knife was stuck blade down into the wood. There was nothing stolen, no sign of someone living there, just the quiet message left in the way everything was disturbed. Whoever it was wanted me to know they could get inside whenever they wanted. I spent that night locked in my truck, shotgun across my lap, headlights pointed at the cabin. I didn't sleep. Every shadow in the brush looked like movement. Every sound made me grip the stock tighter. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded what I could into the truck, slammed the cabin door shut, and drove out without looking back. I never returned to that farm. Within a month, I sold it cheap to a man from out of state who wanted hunting land. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I made it clear the cabin needed more work than he might expect. To this day, I don't know who it was. Maybe some drifter living off the land, maybe someone who had a claim to that cabin long before me. All I know is that once you realize you're being watched, once you know someone is testing the edges of your safety, the place stops feeling like home, turns into a trap. That farm could have been my dream, but all I remember now is the sound of footsteps in the dark and the sight of my door hanging open, telling me in no uncertain terms that I didn't belong there. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours when I came across the dirt road that cut deep into the trees. I was in northern Michigan, not far from the Upper Peninsula, taking back roads to avoid the busy highway. It was mid-October, cold but not yet snowing, and the woods looked endless on both sides. The dirt road wasn't on my map, and there was no sign marking it, but I pulled over for a moment just to stretch. My legs were stiff, and my back ached from sitting too long. When I stood there, I noticed faint tire tracks pressed into the dirt. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't old enough to be washed away by rain. Out of simple curiosity, I decided to follow the path on foot for a while. I locked my car, shoved my hands into my jacket pockets, and started walking. The woods were quiet. Every now and then, I heard a crow in the distance or the sound of dry leaves breaking under my boots. After 10 minutes of walking, the road opened into a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. An old cabin, sagging on one side, with the roof covered in moss and the windows either broken or boarded up. It didn't look like anyone had been there in decades, but something about it made me stop. The boards over the windows weren't weathered like the rest of the wood. They looked newer. Someone had been there in the past few years at least, maybe even more recent than that. I walked closer, stepping carefully over fallen branches. The door was shut, but it leaned slightly open, the frame warped with age. The porch creaked under my weight, and I could smell the sharp, dry scent of old wood and damp earth. I pushed the door gently with my boot, and it swung inward without much effort. The inside was dark, colder than the outside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and old rot. A few rays of light leaked in through cracks in the boards, landing on the warped floorboards. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Dust floated in the air, catching the light. The first thing I noticed was a chair in the corner, sitting upright, as if someone had placed it there with care. It wasn't broken, just old. The second thing was the fireplace, full of ashes. Not ancient, not decades old. Ashes that looked gray and soft, like someone had used the fireplace not long ago. That detail unsettled me. I should have left then, but my curiosity kept me moving forward. I walked slowly around the one-room cabin, running my hand along the rough wooden wall. There was a table with one leg broken and a metal pot lying on the floor beside it. In the far corner, I saw something else. A narrow doorway that led into a smaller back room. I hesitated before stepping closer. The floor groaned under me, and I had to put my hand against the wall for balance. The doorway had no door, just an empty frame, and beyond it, the smaller room looked even darker. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut across the room, revealing a cot pushed up against the wall. The blanket on it was filthy, but it wasn't disintegrating the way everything else seemed to be. Someone had been sleeping there not years ago, but recently. On the floor near the cot was a pair of boots. Big, heavy boots, caked with dried mud. I froze when I saw them. They weren't mine. They didn't belong to some long-gone owner, and they weren't rotting away with age. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the room. Against the far wall was a stack of empty food cans, piled neatly. Not old, rusted cans, shiny ones with modern labels. I felt my chest tighten. Someone had been living here, maybe still was. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears for the smallest sound. The silence felt unnatural, pressing down on me until I could hear my own heartbeat. I turned off the flashlight and backed out of the room slowly, step by step, making sure not to trip over the broken boards. When I reached the main room again, I stopped to listen. Nothing. No breathing, no movement. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I wanted to leave right away, but I forced myself to look around one more time. On the wall near the fireplace, there were scratches. Long, deep scratches in the wood. They weren't made by an animal. They were straight lines, carved in with a knife. For marks close together, then a space, then another four. Over and over. Dozens of sets all the way up the wall. That was enough. My skin felt tight, like it didn't fit right, and my stomach turned with a sick weight. I stepped out of the cabin and back into the daylight, but even outside I didn't feel safe. The trees seemed thicker than before, the shadows deeper. As I started down the dirt road, I glanced back. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the cabin doorway, a shift of darkness against the lighter frame. My pace quickened, then turned into a jog. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled the keys. I drove out of there fast, dirt spraying up behind the tires. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out onto the road, but it stayed empty. When I finally reached a gas station an hour later, I sat in the parking lot for a long time before going inside. I couldn't shake the images from my head. The boots, the cans, the scratches in the wood. Someone had been there, living in that cabin, and I had walked right into their space without knowing. The worst part was how silent it had been. If I had heard even a whisper of movement, I could have convinced myself it was just a drifter, someone passing through. But the stillness made me feel like whoever stayed there had been hiding, watching me, waiting for me to leave. I've never gone back to that part of Michigan. I don't take dirt roads anymore, no matter how curious I get. Every time I drive through the woods, I think about that cabin, and I wonder who was living there, what they were doing out in the middle of nowhere, and why they stayed so quiet while I walked through their home. All I know is that if I had stayed just a little longer, I might not have walked back out. It had been raining since the morning, the kind of steady rain that soaks the ground until it turns to mud and makes everything smell of wet earth and damp leaves. I had been working on a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Arkansas, miles from the nearest paved road. It was the spring of 1998, and I had decided to build the cabin on my own as a sort of retreat. I wasn't young anymore, 37, with more aches than I liked to admit, but I wanted a place far from people, where I could be left with my thoughts and the quiet. The cabin wasn't much yet, just a frame with half the siding nailed up, a roof covered in tar paper, and a rough floor that creaked when I walked across it. No insulation, no electricity, no plumbing. Just a shelter I was slowly making into something livable. That night, the rain had come harder, wind sweeping through the trees, rattling the loose boards I hadn't secured yet. The noise of it filled the cabin, a mix of dripping, creaking, and the constant hiss of water hitting the forest floor outside. By late evening, I had decided to stay the night. My truck was parked a half-mile down a muddy trail, and I didn't feel like walking out in the dark storm just to sit in the cab. I had brought a small cot, a lantern, and some food. I figured I'd ride out the weather and keep working in the morning. I lit the lantern and set it on an old crate. The shadows it threw across the unfinished walls made the cabin look even smaller than it was. My clothes were damp from hauling wood earlier, and the cold had started to creep into my joints. I heated a can of beans on a small camp stove and ate while the storm thrashed outside. It was around midnight when I noticed something that made the air feel different. I had been lying on the cot, listening to the rain and the branches cracking under the weight of water, when I realized there was a new sound in the mix. A crunching noise, faint but clear, not like the shifting of trees or the drip of rain. It was steady, like footsteps moving across the wet ground outside. I sat up, holding my breath. At first, I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound didn't match. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The mud sucked at the steps, slow and careful, moving around the cabin in a half circle. I turned down the lantern, lowering the light so only a faint glow remained. The shadows pressed in harder, the corners of the cabin darker than before. My heart was beating hard in my chest, and every creak of the wood beneath me seemed too loud. I stayed still, listening. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time, on the far side where the boards were loose. The rain masked most of it, but every so often I caught the sound of weight shifting on wet ground. Whoever or whatever it was, they were outside my cabin, moving slowly like they didn't want to be noticed. I thought about the hammer I had left on the floor by the wall. My hand reached for it, gripping the wooden handle so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't move from the cot. I didn't even breathe heavy. I just waited. Minutes dragged on. The rain kept pounding, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the unfinished walls. I wanted to believe it was just my nerves, that the woods could play tricks when you were alone too long. But then, faintly, I heard the soft scrape of something against the wood siding. A finger or maybe the edge of a boot. Not an accident, too slow, too measured. I held the hammer tight and leaned forward. The lantern light flickered against the wet boards, and I felt the cold seep deeper into the cabin. I thought about yelling out, making some kind of noise to scare off whoever was there. But something in me said that wasn't smart. Instead, I waited, frozen in the silence between the storm and those sounds outside. Then suddenly, nothing. The noises stopped. No more footsteps, no more scraping. Just the rain hammering down and the trees shaking. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the dark edges of the cabin, waiting for something to happen again. My body was stiff from sitting so still, but I didn't move until the first light of dawn filtered through the gaps in the boards. When I finally stepped outside, the world looked washed out, soaked in gray. The ground was a mess of mud and puddles, the trees dripping with water. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but when I walked around the side of the cabin where I had heard the sounds, I froze. The mud was covered in prints. Not boots like I expected, but bare feet. Dozens of them, pressed deep into the muck, circling the cabin in slow, uneven steps. Some small, some larger, all barefoot. They went right up to the walls, then back out toward the trees, fading into the woods. The rain had blurred some of the edges, but they were clear enough to know I hadn't imagined it. Someone, or more than one person, had been walking barefoot through the storm, all around the cabin while I sat inside, listening. I looked into the trees, wet and silent now, nothing moving but the drip of water. My stomach felt hollow. I couldn't think of any reason for those prints to be there. Not that deep in the woods, not in the middle of the night during a storm. I packed up everything I had inside, the lantern, the stove, the cot, and carried it down the muddy trail to my truck. The hammer never left my hand until I climbed into the cab and locked the doors. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I finally forced myself to return, the ground had dried and the prints were gone. The cabin stood where I had left it, quiet and unfinished. But every time I walked those woods afterward, I felt watched, like eyes followed me from somewhere between the trees. I finished the cabin that summer, but I never stayed in it overnight again. I kept it as a place to rest while working during the day, nothing more. The memory of that night, those slow, careful steps in the mud and the bare footprints circling the walls, was enough to keep me from sleeping there. The rain still reminds me of that place. On nights when it beats against the roof of my house, steady and unrelenting, I find myself listening for footsteps outside, half expecting to hear them start again. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week in a rented cabin in northern Arizona, not far from the edge of the Navajo Nation. It was early October of 2017, the time of year when the air cools fast after sundown and the nights stretch out longer than you want them to. The cabin was simple, built in the 1970s, with dark wood paneling inside and a sagging porch that creaked under my boots when I carried in supplies. I wasn't there for a vacation in the usual sense. I wanted quiet, a place where I could work on some writing and clear my head after a rough year. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked during the day, made simple dinners at night, and sat on the porch with a lantern while I listened to crickets and coyotes in the distance. The coyotes always howled somewhere far off, in groups that rose and fell like a chorus, but never close enough to make me worry. That was normal. By the third night, something felt different. The woods around the cabin were too quiet, as if the normal sounds of the desert forest had been drained away. No crickets, no owls, just a dead silence that pressed on my ears. I tried to brush it off, but when I took my dog outside before bed, he refused to leave the steps of the porch. He stood stiff, ears high, staring into the tree line as though something was out there. I barely slept that night. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement outside, slow steps on gravel. The porch boards creaked and my stomach sank. My dog growled low in his chest but didn't bark, which scared me more than if he had gone wild. I lay frozen, listening as the steps circled the cabin. Then came a sound I'll never forget. My own name, spoken low, drawn out, as if someone was testing how it felt to say it. The voice was off, like it was trying to mimic me but couldn't quite get the rhythm right. I told myself it was in my head, some trick of nerves and exhaustion. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I found prints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't normal footprints. They were long, narrow, like human feet but stretched. The toes splayed out wider than they should have been. I studied them for a long time, trying to reason with myself, telling myself maybe the ground had distorted them. But they trailed off into the woods, and I knew damn well they weren't mine. I should have packed up and left then, but I stayed. I don't know why, maybe pride, maybe the belief that nothing bad could actually happen to me in the middle of nowhere. That night, it came back. I had locked every door and window, double-checked the shutters, even left a flashlight in every room. Around midnight, I woke to scratching on the outside wall. It wasn't frantic like an animal clawing. It was slow, steady, deliberate, like something wanted me to know it was there. My dog whined and pressed against me on the bed, trembling so hard I could feel it through the mattress. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps on the front door. Not random thumps like a branch blown in the wind. Knocks. I lay there, holding my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocks came again, harder this time, then stopped. For a long stretch, there was nothing, and I started to think maybe whoever or whatever it was had gone. That's when I heard the voice again. It was my mother's voice this time, clear as day, calling me from outside. She had been dead for 2 years. I almost opened the door, and that terrified me the most. Something about the way it called felt wrong, but it dug into my head like a hook, urging me to move, to listen, to obey. I forced myself to stay still until the sound finally faded. At dawn, I opened the door just enough to look out. On the porch rail, there was a smear of something dark, almost black, dried against the wood. It looked like blood, but thicker, and it had a sour, metallic smell that turned my stomach. I stopped using the porch after that. By the 5th night, I was a wreck. I hadn't eaten much, barely slept, and I kept my gun loaded and in reach every moment. The noises never stopped. Footsteps circling the cabin, scratching on the roof, whispers at the window. Sometimes it sounded like laughter, too faint to be sure, but cruel in its tone. I stayed inside with the curtains drawn, lights off, waiting for sunrise. That last night is burned into me. The air was colder than it had been all week, my breath visible inside the cabin. I sat in a chair with the gun in my lap, my dog pressed against my legs, when I heard the back door handle rattle. It turned slowly, over and over, like someone was testing the lock. Then came a scraping sound at the window, fingernails dragging down the glass. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Through the thin curtain, I saw a shape outside. Tall, too thin, its arms hanging longer than they should. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, listening. Then it spoke again, this time in my own voice. Perfect. Hearing myself speak from outside the glass nearly broke me. The figure stayed there for what felt like forever, then finally slipped back into the trees. I sat in that chair until daylight. When the sun came up, I packed my bags. I didn't even care about leaving food or gear behind. I got my dog in the truck and drove out fast, not looking in the mirrors. On the dirt road, I passed a local man fixing a fence line. I stopped long enough to tell him about the noises and the tracks. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, told me not to stay out here alone again, and went back to his work without another word. That was the last time I stayed in any cabin by myself. Even now, years later, I can't sit outside at night without thinking of that voice calling my name, or the sight of those stretched footprints vanishing into the woods. It was real as the ground under me, as real as the silence that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. And I know one thing with certainty: whatever was outside that cabin wasn't an animal, and it sure as hell wasn't human. I had been driving for hours when I finally pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt trail that cut through the trees. The plan was simple. A weekend alone at a hunting cabin an old coworker told me about. He'd used it years ago but said it had been sitting empty since. I was 34 at the time, and I thought a couple days away from the noise of the city would do me some good. It was late October 1998. The air sharp and cool, leaves curled brown on the ground. The cabin wasn't much to look at when I reached it. Small, built from rough logs, the roof sagging a little in the middle. The porch boards bowed under my boots as I carried in my gear. The door creaked, the hinges stiff. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old ashes. A single table stood by the window, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. A rusted wood stove sat in the corner. It wasn't welcoming, but it was shelter. I unloaded my pack, set my rifle against the wall, and stacked some firewood I'd brought in the truck. The sun was already dipping low, the woods outside dimming quick. I built a fire in the stove, the crack of the kindling filling the silence. The glow of the flames softened the room, but it didn't warm the feeling I had in my chest. Something about the place felt off. like it hadn't been touched in years yet still carried the weight of someone's presence. I tried to ignore it. I ate some canned stew, washed it down with water from a jug, and sat listening to the fire pop. The quiet was heavy, pressing. I thought I heard movement outside more than once, the dry crunch of leaves, but every time I stood at the window, I saw nothing but the shadows of the trees swaying. The woods can play tricks on your ears when you're alone, I told myself. By nightfall, the wind picked up. It rattled the loose boards on the cabin walls and whistled through cracks I hadn't noticed. I checked the door twice, slid the old bolt into place. I lay on the cot with my sleeping bag zipped to my chin, staring at the dark ceiling. My rifle leaned close enough that I could reach it without standing. Sleep came in short pieces, broken by the creaks of the cabin and the sound of the forest outside. Around midnight, I woke to a noise sharp enough to sit me upright. It wasn't the wind. It was a solid, deliberate sound. A footstep on the porch. Slow, careful. Then another. My mouth went dry. I reached for the rifle, kept still, my ears straining. The boards groaned again. Someone was outside the cabin. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only minutes. The footsteps shifted, then faded, but I couldn't shake the sense that whoever it was hadn't gone far. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the faint glow of the stove until it died to embers. In the morning, the world seemed normal again. The trees swayed, birds chirped, frost glittered on the grass. But when I stepped outside, my stomach sank. Tracks led up to the porch. Bootprints. Not mine. They circled the cabin, stopping at the back window, then returned to the woods. Someone had been there, watching. I walked the tree line, following the trail until it disappeared into thicker brush. Whoever it was, they knew how to move in the woods. No broken branches, no clear sign of where they'd gone. I went back to the cabin uneasy, my nerves buzzing. The day dragged. I tried to set traps, took a short walk with the rifle, but I couldn't focus. Every snapped twig made my head jerk. Every gust of wind sounded like movement. By late afternoon, I decided I'd leave in the morning. A weekend away wasn't worth whatever was going on out here. That night was worse. The fire in the stove burned low, shadows stretched across the walls. I sat at the table with the rifle laid flat, listening. The wind eased, and the silence was so complete it hurt my ears. Then it started again. Soft steps in the leaves outside, circling, stopping, circling again. I froze, barely breathing. The porch boards groaned under weight. Then a slow scrape slid across the wall, like a hand trailing along the logs. My heart hammered. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to know they were out there. I kept the rifle in my hands, finger resting along the trigger guard. I thought about yelling, but something told me not to. I stayed silent. Minutes dragged. Then, just as sudden as it started, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair until my eyes ached, waiting for dawn. When light finally seeped through the trees, I packed fast. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about leaving wood stacked. I slung the rifle over my shoulder, grabbed my gear, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw it. A small strip of fabric caught on the splintered edge of one of the boards. Dark green, torn from a jacket. Fresh. I loaded the truck with shaking hands. The woods were silent again, too silent. I got behind the wheel, turned the key, and drove that dirt trail faster than I should have. Rocks spitting out from under the tires. I didn't look in the mirrors until I hit the main road. But when I finally did, the cabin was swallowed by the trees, gone like it was never there. I never went back. I don't even know if the cabin still stands. What I do know is that somebody else was out there with me those nights. They knew I was alone, knew I was unarmed if they moved fast enough, knew the layout of the cabin better than I did. Maybe it was a drifter, maybe a local who didn't like strangers on their land. I'll never know, but I can still feel the weight of those footsteps on the porch, slow and patient, as if they had all the time in the world. I was 34 years old the summer I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin up in the northern part of Montana. It wasn't really a vacation, more of a way to get away from the constant noise of the town and the pressure of work. My dog, a 6-year-old German Shepherd named Ranger, was the only company I wanted. He had a steady presence, and I trusted him more than most people. I rented the cabin through a small local listing, the kind that didn't get much traffic online, and when I arrived, it was clear the place hadn't been updated in years. The cabin sat about half a mile off a dirt road, surrounded by thick pine woods that stretched so far in every direction it felt like the world just ended out there. The structure itself was small, a one-room box with a loft and a wood stove, the kind of place that creaked in the wind. It had running water from a pump outside, but no electricity. A gas lantern and a few candles were all I had for light. That didn't bother me. I thought the quiet and darkness would be a welcome break. The first 2 days were easy. I woke up with the sun, cooked on a small propane stove I brought, and spent most of the day walking the trails with Ranger. He stayed close, ears up, always scanning the woods like he was keeping watch. At night, we sat on the porch and listened to the forest. Sometimes I heard coyotes yipping in the distance, sometimes just the wind. Ranger always stayed calm, so I stayed calm too. By the third night, I started to notice things. Small things, but enough to stick in the back of my mind. A branch snapping too close to the cabin. The sound of something moving through the brush but not showing itself. Ranger would lift his head, ears forward, eyes locked on the dark tree line. He didn't bark at first, just watched. His body was tense, ready. That unsettled me more than anything I could hear myself. On the fourth day, we went farther down a trail that followed a narrow creek. The air was cooler there, damp, and the smell of moss and wet soil was heavy. I stopped at the bank to let Ranger drink, and I noticed tracks in the mud. At first I thought they were deer, but they were too wide, and the stride was strange. Not boots either. Barefoot, but large, longer than my own foot, and deep enough that whoever made them was heavy. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. Ranger was sniffing the tracks too, his nose low, his tail stiff. He didn't wag. That told me all I needed. I cut the walk short and went back to the cabin. The rest of the afternoon, I tried to distract myself by chopping wood and tidying up inside, but I couldn't shake the thought of those tracks. Who the hell would be barefoot out there, deep in the woods, far from any town? That night, sleep didn't come easy. Ranger lay at the foot of the bed, his breathing slow, but every so often he'd lift his head and stare toward the door. Around midnight, I woke up to him growling, low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the room. I froze, listening. There it was, the crunch of leaves outside, slow, deliberate. Not an animal darting around. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin. My heart hammered so loud I swore whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I just gripped the handle of the hunting knife I kept beside the bed. Ranger was rigid, staring at the door, teeth showing. The steps circled once, then faded back into the trees. I lay there until the sky lightened with dawn, too scared to even close my eyes again. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. In the soft dirt by the porch steps, the same barefoot tracks I'd seen by the creek were pressed deep into the ground. They were fresh. I knew then that someone had been standing just feet from me while I lay in bed. That day was long. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept Ranger close, and he never really relaxed, pacing more than usual, sniffing the air. I thought about leaving early, but the road was rough, and I wasn't sure my old truck could handle it in the rain that had started that afternoon. The storm made the forest darker than it should have been, even before nightfall. When darkness came again, I lit the lantern and tried to read, though my eyes never really left the windows. Ranger sat by the door, ears pricked, muscles tight. The rain beat against the roof, masking other sounds, which made it worse. Around 2 a.m., Ranger snapped his head toward the back wall of the cabin and let out a deep bark. Then another. I killed the lantern instantly, plunging the cabin into darkness. The rain wasn't enough to hide it this time. I heard movement again. Someone was outside, moving slow, pressing against the walls like they were testing for weak spots. My throat went dry. Ranger was barking now, loud, fierce, throwing himself at the door. The footsteps stopped. For minutes, nothing. Just the rain and my dog's heavy breathing. I thought maybe whoever it was had left. Then a hard knock on the wall. Just once. Firm. Close. Ranger went wild. I gripped my knife so tight my hand hurt. I wanted to scream, to charge out, but I stayed frozen. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually the rain swallowed every sound, and the knocking stopped. When morning came, I stepped outside with Ranger at my side. The ground was soaked, but near the back wall, clear as anything, were more tracks. Bare feet again, bigger than before. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time, watching, listening. That was it for me. I didn't care if my truck got stuck. I packed what little I had in 10 minutes flat, loaded Ranger, and drove out, bouncing and sliding down the muddy road. My hands shook the whole way, and I didn't breathe easy until the cabin was a speck behind me. When I reached the nearest small town, I stopped at a gas station to fill up. The attendant told me the cabin I stayed in was rarely rented out anymore. Too remote, too many complaints. People said they felt watched, followed. Some had cut their trips short just like I did. He shrugged it off like it was nothing, but I could see in his eyes that he knew more than he said. I never went back. Even now, years later, when Ranger is old and gray and spends most of his time sleeping at my feet, I can't forget those nights. The sound of someone circling the cabin, the heavy bare footprints in the mud, the knock on the wall in the rain. There was no ghost, no fairy tale monster, just someone out there, living or hiding in those woods, watching me and my dog. That was enough to make me never want to spend another night in a lonely cabin again. I was 36 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rented cabin in northern Michigan. It was early October of 2009, the kind of fall where the air felt sharp in the mornings, but the afternoons still carried the smell of pine and damp leaves. I had been working long hours at my job in Grand Rapids, and I wanted quiet, a place to breathe without phones, traffic, or office chatter. The cabin sat about 5 miles off a narrow county road, down a gravel path that had weeds poking through in the center. It was one of those old structures built in the 1950s, just a rectangle of wood with a tin roof, a porch out front, and one chimney that leaned slightly to the right. The first thing I noticed when I pulled in was how still it felt. No sounds of cars, no dogs barking, no hum of people, just the steady hiss of wind moving through the trees. The place looked abandoned in a way, but it had running water and a generator that the owner promised would last the week if I didn't overdo it. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old firewood. The floor creaked no matter where I stepped, and the single bedroom had a thin mattress on a metal frame. There was no cell service, and that was part of the appeal. The first day passed easily. I carried in my supplies, mostly canned food, bottled water, a small cooler, and a few books. By evening, I had a fire going in the small wood stove and was eating soup straight from the pot. The wind picked up that night, whistling through gaps in the boards. I noticed one of the windows didn't close all the way, and the draft carried the smell of wet leaves inside. I wasn't bothered. I told myself this was what I wanted, the raw silence of nature. By the second day, I settled into the rhythm of the woods. I walked the trail that wound behind the cabin, where the ground was soft and covered in needles from the pines. I didn't see another person, not even a hunter or a truck passing on the far-off road. That night, though, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, writing notes in a small journal, when I thought I heard something outside, just a faint crunch, like a step on dry leaves. I froze and listened. The fire popped, and the wind moved again, and I told myself it was probably a branch falling. But the sound had been too sharp, too deliberate. Later, when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay on my back, staring at the wooden ceiling beams, and heard faint movement outside again, this time closer to the porch. It wasn't the wind. It was slower, heavier, as if someone was walking around the cabin with careful steps. My chest tightened, and I sat up, listening hard. Then silence. No more steps, just the distant groan of trees. Eventually I fell asleep, but it was restless. The third day I kept checking around the cabin. There were damp spots on the ground from the night air, and I saw what looked like footprints near the side of the porch. They weren't clear, but they were there, pressed into the soft dirt, larger than mine. I crouched and stared at them, tracing the outline with my eyes, but then I forced myself to laugh it off. Hunters, maybe, or a stray camper passing through. Still, the cabin was 5 miles off the road. You wouldn't just stumble onto it unless you knew where it was. That night, it became impossible to ignore. I had just turned off the lantern and lay down when the creaking started. Not the floor inside, the boards of the porch outside. Slow weight pressing down, then lifting. My pulse pounded in my ears. I sat up, straining to hear, my hand gripping the flashlight I kept by the bed. The sound moved from the front porch to the side of the cabin, then stopped. I held my breath. Minutes stretched and nothing else happened. The following morning, I checked again. The dirt showed more signs now, clearer impressions, definitely boot prints. Whoever it was had stood near the side window. My stomach dropped when I saw how close. They had been right next to the glass while I was inside, less than 2 feet away. I felt exposed in that moment, like the trees themselves were leaning in on me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it had been the owner checking on the place, though he'd told me no one would come out here all week. On the 5th night, it escalated. I woke around 2 in the morning to the sound of metal scraping. Not the stove, not the generator, something against the back door. My throat went dry. I sat up in the dark, gripping the flashlight, not daring to move. The scrape came again, longer this time, as though someone was dragging a tool across the doorframe. My hands trembled. I forced myself to turn on the light, and the beam caught the wood grain of the door. The noise stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. Whoever was out there was listening too. I didn't sleep after that. I sat with my back against the wall, the flashlight aimed at the door, waiting for the first sign of light. When morning came, I opened the door carefully. The frame showed marks, long scratches, not deep, but fresh. They hadn't been there before. I stared at them, knowing with certainty now that someone had been trying to get inside. I lasted one more night. It was the worst of all. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, slower, heavier, deliberate. They stopped and started, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were out there. I sat frozen in the dark, not moving, every sound magnified in my head. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside the thin wall by my bed. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would give me away. Hours passed like that, until the faint gray of morning crept through the window. By then, I'd made my decision. I packed everything quickly, not bothering to eat. I loaded the car, checking the tree line constantly, certain I'd see someone watching. The drive back down the gravel road felt endless, every turn of the tires too slow. When I finally reached the county road, I didn't stop until I was back in town. Later, I told myself it might have been a drifter, maybe someone living in those woods, maybe just a hunter who thought the cabin was empty. I never went back to find out. What stayed with me wasn't just the sounds or the footprints. It was the deliberate nature of it all, the circling, the watching, the scratches on the door. Whoever it was hadn't just passed by. They had stayed. They had waited. And if I had ignored it one night longer, I don't know what would have happened once that door finally gave way. I never rented a cabin alone again. I was 36 the year I decided to take a trip out to a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was the fall of 2014, late October, the kind of time when the air bites a little sharper and the trees shed the last of their color. I had rented the place from an older man who listed it online. It wasn't fancy at all. One room, a small wood stove, a table, a bed that creaked whenever you shifted on it, and a single window facing the tree line about 50 yards out. The location was remote enough that you had to drive 15 miles off a main road, then another mile down a narrow gravel track that looked more like a deer trail than a driveway. I told myself I wanted peace and quiet, away from people and noise, but part of me knew I was running from something too. My marriage had ended earlier that year, and most nights in the city I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to traffic, not really sleeping. So the idea of woods and silence appealed to me. The first day was calm. I spent the daylight hours chopping some wood left behind in a pile near the shed. The cabin had no electricity, just a lantern and the wood stove, so I knew I'd need a decent stock of logs to keep warm. By sunset, the cabin was filled with that smell of burning pine, and I sat with a notebook, trying to write down my thoughts. It was only when the dark settled in fully that the place felt different. In the city, dark is never truly dark. There's always the glow of streetlights, the sound of cars, people moving. Out there, the dark was complete. When I blew the lantern out, I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The silence pressed against my ears so hard I caught myself straining to hear anything at all. That night, I lay in bed listening. First, there was nothing. Then, slowly, I began to notice tiny things. The creak of the cabin timbers as they cooled, the distant snap of a branch outside, the low rustle of wind moving through the pine needles. None of it was unusual, but alone in that silence, every sound felt magnified. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I hiked down to the small stream that cut through the woods about a quarter-mile away. I filled up a couple jugs of water and rinsed my face in the cold flow. The day passed quietly, but late in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line, I saw a piece of rope tied around a pine trunk, frayed and old, leading to nothing. It wasn't mine. It had been there for a while, I guessed maybe left by someone long before, but something about it unsettled me. It meant people had been there, maybe used that spot for something. I untied it and tossed it aside, trying not to think about it. That night, the silence pressed harder. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside. It wasn't the crack of a branch or the sigh of wind. It was deliberate. Heavy steps on the ground, close to the cabin. My first thought was a deer, but the steps were too slow, too heavy. My skin crawled as I listened. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other, stopping for long moments, then starting again. I didn't move from the bed, just stared at the black ceiling. After what felt like an hour, they stopped. I don't know if sleep ever came back to me, but when I sat up, the window was pale with morning light. I told myself it was a moose or maybe even a bear. Large animals wandered through these woods all the time. I was sure of it. Still, I walked the clearing that morning, scanning the ground for tracks. The soil was damp enough to hold prints. I saw a few deer marks, some squirrel diggings near the shed, but no clear tracks of anything heavier. I tried to push it from my mind. By the third night, unease settled in me before the sun even went down. I added extra wood to the stove, wanting the sound of the crackling fire to fill the silence. I lay in bed, eyes open, waiting. Hours passed, and then, like before, I heard movement outside. This time, slower, more deliberate. My heart pounded against my ribs. The steps came up near the wall where my bed was. I could hear the crunch of leaves just feet from my head. Then came the sound that froze me completely, the quiet scuff of something dragging across the wooden wall of the cabin. A fingernail? A stick? I didn't know, but it was slow, scraping, almost testing. I didn't breathe. My hand hovered near the flashlight on the nightstand, but I didn't dare turn it on. After a while, the sound faded. In the morning, I checked the wall outside. There were fresh scratches across the wood. Not deep, but enough to be seen. Not the kind of marks left by an animal pawing. These were straight, vertical, deliberate. I stood there staring at them, my breath coming out in white clouds. I told myself to leave, to pack up and go. But something in me resisted, maybe pride, maybe denial. I had come out there to get away from things, and the thought of fleeing after 3 nights made me feel weak. So I stayed. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, I stacked more logs by the stove and set the lantern on the table. I couldn't sit still. My nerves were stretched thin. I kept pacing the small room, peeking through the window though it showed nothing but my own reflection in the glass. When it finally came, it was worse than before. The footsteps returned, circling slower, stopping for longer stretches. I sat in the chair by the table, gripping the handle of the hatchet I had used to split wood. My palms were slick with sweat. The sound moved to the porch, the faint creak of the wooden step outside the door. The door shuddered once, like someone tested it with a shoulder. Then silence again. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the door, hatchet in hand, the fire burning low. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag, shoving clothes and the notebook inside, and carried everything to the car. The cold morning air stung my face, and every sound in the trees felt like it was aimed at me. When I slammed the trunk shut, it echoed like a gunshot in the still woods. I drove fast down the gravel track, the car bouncing over ruts, the trees whipping past. Only when I reached the main road and saw the wide stretch of asphalt did I finally feel the tension drain, replaced by a heavy exhaustion. Later, when I dropped the cabin key in the mailbox for the owner, I thought about those nights, the steps, the scratches, the pressure on the door. It wasn't ghosts or my imagination. Someone had been out there, watching, testing, waiting, and the thought of what might have happened if I had stayed one more night is something that still keeps me awake years later. I never went back, and I never will.